by design, the configuration is supposed to maximize the competitiveness of eCash as a whole. Because it's supposed to be like, hey, if there's an L2 that actually is a terrible design, it's going to lose to some other L2. And this is a very healthy evolution.
All sorts. Pete Rizzo, it's the eCash dispatch. Rumbling and tumbling of altcoins coming down. It's happening out there in the market. Want to get into this episode, Paul, your thoughts about really what we're seeing in there, the crumbling of the Ethereum maximalist position. We've talked a lot last week about Bitcoin maxis, our own identity crises, but there's a larger come to Jesus, shall we say, in the altcoin market happening where they're realizing that the economics of alternative cryptocurrencies are failing. Your thoughts?
Well, I was always a big skeptic of Ethereum. So, but I think that it's interesting that in this article that you sent to me at the beginning, he has this idea of the money as a coordination game, which is basically a restatement of my idea that the network effects of money are really important. It's the idea like everyone speaks English. English is just getting bigger. The big get bigger every year. The rich get richer, and like if you speak some obscure Navajo dialect, it's like dying out, and no one's going to put the effort in to learn that. So that was the first point that this guy wanted to make, and that's a point I always emphasize, that it's like really going to be really hard to compete with the biggest.
Well, maybe let's back up.
Yeah.
This is the David Hoffman piece, viral on X last week. It's essentially saying, why I sold my ETH. This was the big Ethereum maximalist, Bankless, the big Ethereum maximalist podcast. Has a lot of connotations for what's happening with eCash, right? You have the maximalist position. Ethereum really thought that it could be money, that it could replace Bitcoin as the digital money.
Well, I think that Ethereum saw an opening with BTC in 2016 because there was this scaling dispute in BTC, and people it wasn't cut and dry. It wasn't totally clear like which side either would win or should win. It was, a lot of people felt very strongly about it, but it wasn't like, it was like a big moment of dispute, as you and I remember. And into that walked Ethereum, which said, okay, maybe Bitcoin doesn't have it all figured out. We might need a competitor, an alternative. So Ethereum set about becoming very different from BTC in many ways. And this is the article also describes this, where BTC was more conservative and Ethereum was more liberal in terms of just weird changes they were willing to make, and kind of experiments, risks they were going to take. They put all this weird stuff, proof of stake, and like uncle blocks and weird other stuff like that. So they put all this weird stuff in there. I think it's kind of interesting. The L2 angle is what most interests me, where it's kind of the Ethereum is sort of thinking like, we want these L2s. This is, again, another thing that I've always been saying, that we want the L2s. Ethereum has to kind of compete with, because like eventually Ethereum blocks filled up, and they kind of had their own exact scaling. It wasn't exactly the same, of course, but there was kind of like Ethereum versus Solana versus like Base, or versus like Binance Smart Chain, or like these weird other stuff that kind of sometimes came and went, but sometimes came and stayed, like Solana being a big example of that. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around it, but they were kind of like the similar thing, where Solana was like, okay, Ethereum's not very decentralized. We're going to be even less decentralized. And I don't know, like, what would you say is the summary of, what is the L2 puzzle piece in this?
Well, it seems like, essentially this is what I stumbled on. I kept an open mind about Ethereum for a very long time. You may remember when I was CoinDesk, I was the editor-in-chief there. I was, pretty positive, and we did a lot of, coverage on Ethereum. I would say like up until DeFi summer, I sort of knew both kind of maximalist camp narratives, and people who go back on my Twitter timeline would find that I even bought some ETH in 2019, basically saying, look, I don't believe the ETH thesis, but I want to make sure I'm properly hedged here. And, really where it stopped making sense for me was DeFi summer, where you're 3 tokens deep up the chain, you're mining yams in a pool on top of another, protocol. And there's essentially, there was no economic value transfer. I think this is really something that the broader community is struggling with. And it's really interesting in light of eCash, which is essentially, the other coins kind of have tried to have their economic scale with layer twos, and it just doesn't seem to work, right? We saw there was kind of this big rush of like big people creating Ethereum L2s, but now they've all issued their own tokens. So there's no like strict economic arrangement between these different layers. And that was very clear in the summer of 2019 once you got to kind of a layer 3 DeFi protocol that this token was going up even though the second layer token was going down, and there was no price accrual or value accrual across the stack, right? The dream, I think, of sidechains that you've articulated has always been you lock Bitcoin or a crypto asset, it goes into another chain, but then the economic activity that is in that second chain accrues somehow to the base layer of the people who are powering it. And so with Ethereum, I think we've just seen that, and I think they got up several layers here very quickly. Once you're on a token of a token of a token, there was just no value accrual. And so a lot of what David Hoffman's talking about here, and again, it's a great authentic piece. I think people should read it. Because again, he's being very clear about his narrative and honest about where he thinks there have been failures. But he sees there was a rise of L2s, there was intellectual firepower that went into backing these L2s, but the economics of them staying within the Ethereum world never made sense. They broke out on their own, issued their own tokens, and ultimately you ended with the same fragmentation that eCash is essentially rallying against.
Well, I think, I've always been a champion of the merge mined L2. So actually, I feel like this is almost like this Ethereum speed ran what I predicted like in 2015, and then I re-predicted it in when I went at Op Next in November 2024, and I said, well, hey, actually, if we live in a world where Lightning Network is super super successful, you have, for example, 8 billion people using the Lightning Network successfully somehow. I don't think that's possible, but just imagine it were possible. The amount of the fee revenue going to like the LSP, the Lightning routing nodes, or Lightning service provider, that would be enormous amount of money, hundreds of billions of dollars. And meanwhile, the miners would not be getting very much. So this is the exact same mismatch between the L1 and L2. That's why I've always championed the merge mined L2. And this is also why I think like stuff like ARC won't work, and stuff like Liquid won't work, and these other things probably won't work. So actually,
Here's like, let me just read this. Like, I think
this
this is the key. This is the key part of this. Oh, I wanted to say, I think there's a key part of this passage. I'll just read it out. It says, from David, at its heart, Ethereum is a giver, not a taker. It supplies L2s with the world's most secure block space. Disagree, but at cost, it tokenizes the assets of the entire world at cost. It secures billions of dollars in DeFi at cost. Ethereum takes no markup for anything that it does.
Well, that's interesting. Let me think about that for a second. Like, I'm not sure exactly how those, every single L2 in Ethereum works, but the idea that I always pitch is that the L1 miners in Bitcoin should get 100% of the transaction fee revenue on all the L2s, and I think this is just a better environment for everyone. I think we don't want it's because it goes something like this. The L1 miners can censor any message from L1, so they can hold the L2s hostage. So I think that it's just natural that we would want, if you run the L2, you should find some other way of making money. But I think Ethereum has gone the other direction. I don't know. Maybe you can point, like, is there like a huge diversity of L2 types in Ethereum, or are they all basically custodial?
Well, what happened is a lot of them were, sort of these bridge architectures, but, they started with the attempt to have some sort of token that was, again, Ethereum derived, but then it just became quickly clear that the way they were incentivizing was tokens. And so they, would release tokens, and those tokens, again, I think it's like, while some of the actual like user experiences worked, like, right, there were applications that moved on to Ethereum L2s, but then you look at like what happened with Uniswap, right, where essentially it started on top of Ethereum, now it has its own coin. Essentially, for all intents and purposes, it became its own ecosystem. You could say the same thing happened to Quantum Cats, or sorry, not Quantum Cats, but Crypto Kitties, right? It was the largest Ethereum NFT project. It was super popular. And now, whereas Crypto Kitties, it has its own blockchain. And so there was this, I think, this continued arc of essentially people launching chains on top of Ethereum, attempting to connect those chains in some way to the base layer Ethereum, finding that the economics just netted out that it was better to have your own token and be your own blockchain. And so I guess this gets to the point of what I wanted to ask about eCash is like, how do you hope eCash undoes this? Because the narrative right now seems to be around L2s that they didn't work, right? Essentially, like we wanted to have the structure, or at least the Ethereum, some of these other chains did, where there was top level layers kind of doing what eCash wants to do, right? Where people have different ideas for moving the token, they can experiment with different things, but there eventually wasn't value accrual to the Ethereum holder. And I think David uses the example here of stablecoins, right? Stablecoins have scaled and they're doing billions and billions and billions of dollars of transactions on Ethereum. But it's hard to say that the ETH price has particularly gained from that. So I guess how do you see it going with eCash? Like, what does eCash have to offer here that is different than this kind of endless cycle of, Ethereum L2s or L2s launching this? And again, I think a lot of Bitcoiners have this perspective as well, right? Where we've seen the L2s kind of come and go and fail. You mentioned Base, right? I think it's pretty clear that Coinbase wanted to build that on Ethereum, right? That wasn't the end result. Essentially, while it's related to Ethereum in some ways, it's essentially its own ecosystem at this point. And so it doesn't seem like we've got that holy grail of what a pure sidechains vision always was, which was that you as the Bitcoin hodler could benefit from all this innovation that was happening elsewhere. That never really materialized.
Well, I don't think, like what you've described is like people didn't enjoy what was happening on Ethereum and in the blockchain. So they made like their own L2 that they could escape to. And then they didn't enjoy what, they didn't enjoy the relationship between their token and the Ethereum like ecosystem. So they launched their own altcoin basically. And that's kind of like in both of those ways, that's kind of the opposite of, my conception of the sidechain, which is that people would, they would find launching their own coin to be kind of intolerably shameful, or I don't know what the word it would be. It would be like you would have no credibility if you did that because everyone would be launching things as, but you would also have the benefit in the drive chain world is that you would not be beholden to the BTC architecture. So you could say, hey, listen, I like some of these things, but I want to have unlimited block size, or I want to have EVM, or I want to write the entire thing in JavaScript or whatever. So you would be able to do that. So I kind of think it's a little bit of the opposite in both of those two ways. It's easy to throw out a suspicion that you just think like, okay, in the Ethereum world, people are more open-minded to like token investments. So they're like more gullible over there. So then this is why we'll launch the CryptoKitties altcoin or something. But that is the opposite of the kind of the drive chain eCash conception of the L2, which is to say, we will be taking all this stuff, everything that's open source, everything that exists, we will be bolting it onto eCash for free, and we will be maintaining it kind of for free because we're just going to copy it. And so that's like and then you shouldn't expect to get any money for that, and you shouldn't expect to get any transaction fees either because that's going to the L1 miners. So,
but the vision here is still with eCash that you'll have the eCash token, the L1 will look like Bitcoin, but the new L2s will add value to eCash. So maybe you could explain like why do you think that thesis is correct?
Well, I think because you want a token that can do everything is superior to a token that can only do one or two things. So I think you'd have to ask the question: why did the ETH L2s leave? My guess is because the temptation, the short-term gain of launching a token and then dumping it. I don't know if that's true. It's just my guess. But I think that, and then it's very hard to build long-run value. But of course, if there's an ecosystem that is committed to building long-run value, it will eventually accrue over time, will accrue more users, and it will eventually have the dominant network effect. And so then its success is eventually guaranteed. If you're the only long-run oriented project, then it's just a matter of getting to that long run. It's just a matter of waiting.
But like at a brass tacks level, you're going to ask people to be committing eCash to launch an L2, right? You need to lock some value on the eCash L1 to launch
the
an
user,
eCash
not to
L2, right?
launch, not really to launch, no, but to use.
No.
To deposit, you have to send the coins over there. But you could theoretically develop one and then propose, notify everyone of its existence, and then hash rate could activate it, even if you were penniless in theory. But of course, without users, it wouldn't make very much sense. So some people would have to
Right, but
go
I'm
over
just,
there.
but just what's the, so then what is the economic relationship between, so then in the L2s, you have an eCash backed new token that's created. How does that provide value back to the eCash layer one token?
Well, yeah, it's like if you deposit like 4 eCash, they show up on the L2, and they have like a different ticker just to keep things clear. But basically, that's also eCash. So it's like when you put a $20 bill into an ATM or something. It's still US dollars, but it is a different format. It's no longer cash. It becomes the checking account balance. And the reason people do that is the same reason that people withdraw and deposit from an ATM, is that you need to go to the strip club or whatever, so you need cash, or you need to, or vice versa. You're coming back from your shift, at the strip club, or you have to deposit the cash so that you can pay your whatever, your internet
But
bill.
so your vision is one where eCash L2s add to L1 demand. So essentially, you have to buy a certain amount of eCash, or there's a limited amount of eCash, and then that's moved to another layer. But essentially, you're still dealing with the same overall total supply.
Yeah, it's the same 21 million coins. And of course, when you have multiple options, such as you have like a privacy L2, scaling L2,
I just want you to, like, imagining there's a dejected Ethereum holders out there, right, who have spent years trying to build Ethereum L2s. Like, why should those folks look at eCash?
well, I think this has happened like a few times where it's like I have this perfectly good idea, like a long time ago, 2014, 2015, and I write it down, and it's perfect just the way it is, if I may say so. And then people try all these weird variants of it. They have all these weird mistakes in them, but they give it the same name. They say this is an L2, or they say this is a sidechain, but they've stripped all the important parts out of it, you know? And then that idea fails. And then people say, well, hey, listen, we already tried that. And it's like, well, you guys are the ones who changed it from this. So I think if what they mean by L2 is something where it's not like it's like this is in L2, it's an excuse for them to launch their own token where they they have admin keys, and they can update the contract whenever they want, and they're like the benevolent dictator of that L2, and it's not, if there's a way they can get rich off of it, then that is an impure motive, because you say, are they really doing this to benefit the user, or are they doing it to benefit themselves? Whereas the original sidechain idea was, because you have the same 21 million coins, and the rest is just open source software. The only reason someone would ever launch an L2 was because you can't benefit selfishly from it. So you filtered all those people out. So the only reason someone would want one is because they say, well, hey, out of all of the existing use cases, here's a new one. And then you have a situation where you have 8 or 9 possible pieces of software for the same 21 million coins to travel amongst. And then, once you add a 9th option, the only people who will go there will be people who say, you know what, out of all the existing options, this is one that works better for me. So it's an endless ratchet. It just says it's only improving over time. And of course, some people will want to have a small number of coins on the pocket money spending scaling sidechain, and some people will want to have a large number of coins in some chain that does something else, prediction markets or whatever. But the point is, you would staple all these things on, and if they don't, they either add value to the whole eCash project, or they add zero value, in which case you just ignore them. So it's a ratchet that only turns in one direction.
One of the other criticisms from this piece was essentially, he said, Ethereum L2s didn't succeed because the builders on L2s didn't have the freedom to build really, and that they actually needed L1 base layer changes to be executed faster in a lot of cases in order to accrue users. So he sort of, David Hoffman in this piece suggests that, essentially there was no incentive for the base layer 1 to propel these chains and give them the tools they needed to succeed. And so there was a breakdown of incentives there. How do you see that playing out with eCash?
Well, I mean, I'm not familiar with all the details, but I did those L2s, were they like paying 100% of their transaction fees down back to L1, the equivalent of the L1 miners? My guess is no, because if they were, then the incentive would have been there the whole time. I think it's also interesting that he's talking about like speed of execution. Um, I mean, the drive chain model, you can change almost everything in the L2, and it can have its own state, and it doesn't have to. So, like, I think that if it's the case that the L2s were actually more constrained in Ethereum, that's just more of a reason to abandon that configuration and go with the one that I recommend, where they have more freedom, actually, more design freedom, I think.
Right, but how will you, as sort of like an L1 administrator or maybe a lead developer, like how will you move? Let's just say there are L2s on eCash that are asking for changes. Will that be synergistic, or how do you plan to approach that?
Well, the L1 will be the same as Bitcoin Core. So there won't be any changes to L1 other than BIP 300 and 301 itself, which live in the enforcer, which is a different piece of software next to the Bitcoin Core. But yeah, we won't change L1 unless Bitcoin Core changes it, because the idea is to tie on L1 with Bitcoin Core and just keep it consistent. But I don't think BIP 300 already allows, for example, you can have unlimited block size or on other unlimited requirements, hardware, software requirements on the L2. And you can already write the L2 like in basically any language. And as by default, there's the same 10-minute block time for all blockchains, but there are ways of, uh, like hacking around that. My view is that most of the people trying to hack around that have misunderstood what they're trying to do.
So if you're coming to build an L2 on eCash and you're expecting sort of a level of service from the L1, you're saying expect the same treatment that you would get on a Bitcoin itself.
I think like maybe what did they want the L1 to do? Because and why? So maybe you could give me an example from the article.
Well, I think if you remember with Ethereum, there was all that talk about blob space, right? So there was essentially a different technical design taken so that arbitrary data was sort of added, and discounted and reweighted against the block size, right? As a way. So when Solana started competing against Ethereum with cheaper fees, there was essentially an elaborate restructuring of sort of how the data was accounted. And this all kind of took place at the base layer at the time that L2s were expanding, right? So I think what you're reading here is someone who has a negative experience of that, of that time and place, and saying, okay, there was a moment in Ethereum where, we had the brain power, we had people building L2s, but L1 didn't move fast enough for those L2s, and then another L1, changed the economics, and it fell apart.
Yeah, well, in BIP 300, the L2s do not have to put any blobs of data on L1, and they don't have to pay any gas fees or anything like that. What they do have is they have their own data availability problem on their own blockchain, but that's by design. That's saying if you want people to sign up for, and this is exactly what Solana got correctly, which is they said, hey, listen, if you want to run a Solana node, it'll be expensive, but if you make it past this cost, it will be a more pleasant. And so that's exactly the configuration we have. Basically, you could make a Solana L2 on eCash, or a base L2 on eCash, or whatever, or an Ethereum one. So you can already, when you launch a new, so the priority is not the survival of each individual L2. In fact, we want them all to compete with each other. But by design, the configuration is supposed to maximize the competitiveness of eCash as a whole, because it's supposed to be like, hey, if there's an L2 that actually is a terrible design, it's going to lose to some other L2. And this is a very healthy evolution. So the idea is they would compete. And yeah, we wouldn't necessarily want, like, maybe Ethereum is actually the wrong configuration and it's going to be eaten by Solana. But in the eCash world, you'd have like Bitcoin Core, Solana, whatever, Zcash, but they would all be L1 and L2, and they would be the same 21 million coins. So you'd have this exact same evolution that's happening in the altcoin world, but it would just happen without the need for new altcoins, which I think the user would vastly prefer. And of course, they'd all be mined by the same L1 miners, which I think the L1 miners would much prefer.
Yeah, I'm trying to contrast these worlds and get you to articulate. So it's like today we live in a world of immense fragmentation. There are some different theses for the fragmentation, right? And this piece brings up a few of them. Is one, that there was the temptation of different coins. eCash, your solution is clear. It's we're going to keep the single coin. But then there's essentially, the question of how the economics of the layers work together, right? And so how does an L1 eCash holder benefit from an L2? The L2 is being successful, and so I think that's the question that I wanted to pose.
Yeah, but what is the question though? Like, what's the?
Well, like in Bitcoin, I think like this is a lot of the like the concern in the culture right now is right. There's been many things built on blockchains, right? One of the things that I say recently that I think you might disagree with is that let's just say MSTR, for example. MSTR is a altcoin that exists within the corporate regulated Wall Street chain.
Mhm.
It's pretty clear that strategy buying Bitcoin has added value to Bitcoin, right? There's a clear economic relationship there. I think you could also argue that like STRC as a derivative, byproduct of strategy has added value to the Bitcoin hodler. The average Bitcoin holder owns a Bitcoin that has more economic power because strategy owns 850,000 Bitcoin. You could make an argument that they have added value to the base
I mean,
holder,
I don't
right?
really actually agree with that 100%. Like, if Strategy didn't own the 850,000, some other people would own the same 850,000, right? So, and I
So
don't
you think
think
the
that.
price would be the same as it was
I
today
think Saylor has
if
depressed
strategy?
the price with his inane ramblings. He's converted us all into a weird cult, and I think we haven't yet paid the price. When all the.
But you don't appreciate that at least the assets that he's issued they have at least they attempt to add value to the Bitcoin hodler, right? Like, isn't that what we want from L2s? Don't we want these L2s to make Bitcoin more
If you mean
valuable?
that there's more buyers or more people who value Bitcoin very highly, and this causes the market exchange rate to go up, that does benefit the Bitcoin community to some extent. It makes us more prestigious overall, and it means people can start companies, people can buy houses and stuff. So that.
Right, and I'd say like you've articulated this thesis for eCash, right? It's like we bring all the cryptocurrencies into Bitcoin, therefore the combined market cap is of eCash
Right.
is the cryptocurrency world. But I may be asking for some specificity on the defined relationships. Like, how do you see the eCash layer one hodler benefiting from this ecosystem of L2s that you want to create? If not, the value of that eCash goes up.
Well, again, I see the network effect is very big. So I think it's kind of a popularity contest at the end of the day. It's kind of like USB A, or whatever is like taking over, where it's in like airports and stuff. So yeah, everyone prefers to use the same standard, as everyone prefers to speak English, which is a popular language, versus an unpopular language. People prefer a QWERTY keyboard layout over some weird other keyboard layout that you would just invent. And people prefer USB A or something that's USB C. They prefer like something standardized, and standardization helps. Like they want all the rail gauge in Europe or whatever is like, until you get to Russia, then it's all like the same width. So all the train cars are interoperable.
But Paul, aren't you saying on some level? So you're saying the value proposition here is Bitcoin today doesn't have any L2s, doesn't have any chains built on top of it. Isn't the value proposition here that eCash with an ecosystem of change will be more valuable than Bitcoin, right?
Yes. Yeah, but it's because it has
As
more customers, more fee paying users.
Right. So your argument is essentially the L2s will attract users. Those users will increase demand for Bitcoin, the eCash, and then the eCash will appreciate as a result of that. So okay, so then in the L2s on eCash specifically, you're suggesting that they're deriving economic value merely from the users then.
Well, when you say deriving value, it's like the user has a problem that they solve. So, like the USDT is a perfect example where people want to make these payments in USDT. And so currently, they go through the trouble of acquiring ETH just to pay the transaction fee on the USDT. So that's exactly how I would imagine it would work in eCash, except for every single use case that the developer could invent.
Got it. So you think that you see eCash then just being the additive fee to all the other existing kind of coin type
Well,
projects?
one of the problems the user faces, I think they don't enjoy the fact that they have to switch from Ethereum to Solana sometimes to send USDT diagonally across or whatever. and they don't appreciate that they have to switch from ETH to BTC. Actually, that's why they have stuff like wrapped BTC. So I think people actually don't like it. That's the same thing as saying you would carry around a bunch of converters for the USB cable. You could have all these cables. There's a lot of inefficiency in the conversion, and of course, when you have to worry about, okay, you really have to keep your finger on the pulse of the cutting edge of technology. If you think, okay, I've got BTC now, Ethereum comes out, but then live by the sword, die by the sword. So Ethereum comes out, but then Solana comes out, and then all the rest. So I think people would actually prefer to live in a world where that doesn't happen, or at least where that doesn't threaten their investment in the crypto coin. So they would rather live in a world where, yeah, all this stuff is being invented and dying off, but it doesn't affect their bottom line. So these are all problems that the regular user would face. And if you solve a problem for the regular user, you add value to them. And if you're the type of thing that's adding value to them, then they will reciprocate. They'll say, well, this coin is at least worth the value it's adding to me, maybe more.
Why will eCash L2s be the best L2s in the market? Why will you attract the best L2 builders?
Well, I think that, it's all about the competitive environment the L2s live. So, we have a kind of like a starter pack of L2s that, again, I think people will like. But there's also L2s that aren't made by us, some of them that we also have in our ecosystem right now. And the point is, it's like this ratchet. People will try things, and then whatever they try, if it works, it will stick around. If it doesn't, it will die off. We have to instead point to things like the block size war, where that was not, because we have it kind of two extremes. On one extreme, you got like hobbyist programmer, tinkerer person. He's trying to find, it's a solution in search of a problem. And he's trying to find, how do I get users? What's the use case? How can I get, this is really cool. This is, whatever it is, it's, these are tree signatures, and, I'm really excited about them, and they're going to be whatever. But then the users don't understand it, or they don't like it. It doesn't solve a problem, so it dies out. That's one extreme. The alternate extreme is like the block size war, where there's this horrible problem like looming over everything and making everyone really miserable. And people are saying, I would pay $1 million. I saw a lot of people tweet or send email that was something like, I would kick in, we have to put in a new conference to try and resolve this issue. I would throw in $1 million and so that was like a multi-trillion dollar issue that's completely sidestepped by the drive chain idea. It says, okay, you don't like what's happening on L1, go to an L2. You don't like what's happening on the L2, make another L2. And so these are, it's really quite, so those are the problems that, the drive chain idea would solve. So I think, and that other stuff, I think, is just a result of people tinkering with the L2 idea and adding problems back into it that you didn't need to add. Because remember, my version is just that all the L2s are merge mined, and that there's no real way for the programmer to profit. That is a key thing, because even though that's sort of communist, what it means is it's not like like moths drawn to a flame. You're not like drawing in all these people who are going to lie and say, this L2 is really, really great, trust me. Because you filtered all that out. You say the L2 is only being added if they love the tech, if they think that they want to use it. So
there's no way in eCash for the L2 operator, they can't operate specifically, they can't profit from simply launching the L2.
Well, I've set it up so that by default it wouldn't be like that. Someone could do that, but they would be vulnerable to someone just kind of copy pasting their thing, launching the totally equivalent version, and just deleting the dev tax or whatever. And I think this is mostly a good thing, because there's too much noise. There's too much distraction in the invention world, and you need people who are really willing to say, I think this idea is actually good for the user. It's like good for someone else other than me. So that would be the best way of filtering out the which ideas are good. Because of course innovation is like a lot of ideas. Well, look bad but actually be good. A lot of ideas will look good but actually be bad. That whole innovation thing is kind of tricky, but this would help us sort the signal out from the noise. So I think that's important.
So it sounds like the step process here is, take the best tech from the crypto world, launch it on eCash, remove the economic incentive for people to issue those types of, or to profit from issuing these types of, different chains. And then you expect that world of chains to then compete against Ethereum and Solana, where it's clear people have, essentially made technologies to profit from themselves.
Yeah, I think the dynamic that Ethereum has with Solana is actually not possible in the eCash world, because there would just be Ethereum style L2 and a Solana style L2. So the competitive dynamic would be copied, but it wouldn't be something where the investor would be at risk of losing their money. And that's why I just think you treat the investor much better. They would want to park their money. I mean, would you rather park your money in? It's like you're playing Russian roulette in the non eCash world, because you're saying, oh, I hope that my chain is one of the ones that survives. But you don't have that problem in the eCash world. You can say, hey, any of these L2s might die or live. I just got my coins on L1. If they do really, really well, I always have the option to use that tech. If they do badly, then it doesn't affect me. So it's a ratchet. It can only accumulate value.
Interesting. So essentially, what happens when an L2 on drive chains or eCash fails?
Well, I think what that would look like is, for some reason, just like people are not using it, it generates almost no transaction revenue, or it's like really hard to run the node, and or it could be both. Like the node has bugs and is hard to run, and it just like the node software really isn't available, and so there's no way of figuring out who actually owns the coins there, and people have long stopped caring about trying to like salvage that situation from like a software point of view. And at that point, it's kind of like there's no way of figuring out where the coins should go. So either they just stay where they are, or the miners can just like withdraw them to themselves if they wanted to coordinate, like carving them up. They could do that over a very slow period, but that would be
So there
possible.
is still the risk of the capital, whoever is putting their capital into the new
Into the
eCash
L2, but
L2.
not into eCash, right? So the idea is that you would be on L1 until you've chosen that you say, okay, I don't, it's more of a risk, but this is the exact same thing as when you do like USDT on Tron. You say, well, hey, listen, I don't know exactly what's going on with Tron, and I don't know if Tron's going to be here next year, but you say, well, hey, this will get me through my transaction today. So it's kind of like you go with it for now, you complete your transactions, and then you probably pull out, a lot of your money back off of that. So there would be some of the chains would be, fly by night. They would be kind of shady. You'd be in kind of like a shady part of town, and you'd kind of want to get in and get out. And others would be more reputable. They would be much simpler, and they would have been around for years. And so, but that's the point: is you'd have the whole range of options, because that shady thing is that's how you get just like a Solana L2 on day one. You say as soon as this is available, this will be spun up, and that's how you get experimentation. But yeah, you would then have the option of using any of these L2s with the coin you have, and you have the one-to-one exchange rate, which is great, because the one-to-one exchange rate means that you don't have to worry about losing money in case the exchange rate moves against you. But also the inability to gain money, that is this filter that says whenever someone puts out the new L2, they have set up engineered a situation where they can't profit by shilling that. So they have to just profit by doing a good job and hoping that people like what they do, and then they hire them to make software and stuff like that. So they have to. It's purely non-hyped. Instead, they have to hype the whole eCash project if they want it to. So that's the ideal thing. Is you're on L1, you passively get all the hype from everyone else doing nothing.
Capital is risked. If the new token, which is pegged to the price to eCash, does well, everyone in eCash benefits. If that token fails, the miners can benefit, and the people in that L2 just go back to the drawing board.
Right.
Paul, we've talked about L2s. There's a lot of people out there who have wanted to build them for a long time. How do they get started on eCash?
Well, I think the easiest way would actually be people to download what we have right now, play around with it, and then go to our GitHub, and then they could fork, one we have a simple one that's called Thunder. You could fork that because that's a completely working L2. So you could fork that, and then you could run all that stuff in like reg test mode with like fake coins, and then you could experiment with that, tinker with that, change the colors and whatever, change the font, change some superficial things, and then you could do your real software engineering after you figure out like, okay, this is exactly what I would do to make my own like Thunder underscore P Rizzo whatever version, and then you would say, okay, what changes do I really want to make? You'd have a much better idea of how to do it by just looking at it, because we have something like 7. We have 8 now. We have 8, I think, maybe L2s of different shapes and sizes out already, and so it would be good to look at those. Those would help. That would help you figure out exactly the details of what to do.
Well, if you're curious of what Bitcoin might look like with L2's eCash project, of course, coming this summer, getting ready for that big hard fork date later this year. Of course, we'll be recapping it all. This is the eCash weekly dispatch. I think this is out for this one.
Okay, well,
L2s are going to 0, except on eCash.
Oh, hey, thanks very much. Until next time.